The salt roads of medieval Europe. Salt, a mineral so simple that you could pinch it between two fingers, carried a weight far greater than its grain suggested. In medieval Europe, salt was not just a seasoning but a substance that defined economies, decided trade routes, built fortunes, and imposed hardships on those who labored to produce it. You might imagine it as something incidental, like the sprinkling on a loaf of bread, but for centuries, salt was the backbone of preservation, enabling food to last through cold winters and long voyages. Without salt, meat spoiled quickly, fish could not be carried inland, and cheese would lose the structure that made it keepable. In this first section, we will explore the origins and mechanics of salt production in medieval Europe, the lives of those who worked in salt pans, mines, and evaporation pits, and how a seemingly dull, white crystal could generate an entire web of roads, carts, toll stations, and townships. The nature of salt and its necessity. To understand why salt shaped history, you have to consider the nature of medieval life. Refrigeration, as you know it, did not exist. Fresh meat slaughtered in summer spoiled within days, often hours. Hunters and farmers turned to salting as their most reliable means of making food endure. Salted pork, salted herring, salted cheese. These became the staples of diets across Europe. Even monasteries, which you might picture as self-sufficient, relied heavily on salt. Monks used it in their refectories to preserve fish, in their dairies for butter and cheese, and even in their medicinal chambers, where it acted as a drying agent. What may sound monotonous to you? The repetition of salt across so many functions was in fact the daily rhythm of survival. But salt did not lie evenly beneath every land. Some places had access to coastal salt pans, others to underground mines, and some had none at all. This uneven geography meant that salt had to travel, and with it traveled wealth, conflict, and taxation. Salt pans of the coast. One of the most common sights along the Atlantic and Mediterranean coasts were salt pans, shallow basins where seawater was collected and left to evaporate under the sun. Picture them, rectangular pools carved from clay or stone, separated by low earthen walls, shimmering faintly as the water slowly receded. The workers who tended these pans were not wealthy merchants, but peasants, bound by obligation or low wages. They spent long days bent over the briny pools, raking and scraping the crystallized salt into piles. Their tools were simple, long-handled rakes, baskets woven of reed, wooden spades blackened from use. The air near salt pans was sharp, stinging the nostrils, leaving workers perpetually parched. Clothing stiffened from the brine, hands cracked, eyes burned from reflection off the shimmering surfaces. The monotony was endless, waiting for water to evaporate, stirring it when needed, collecting it, and beginning again. And yet, out of this labor came something immensely valuable. A cartload of coastal salt could travel inland and multiply in price many times over, feeding entire networks of trade. The mines of the mountains. While coastal regions had pans, other lands relied on salt mines. Perhaps the most famous of these is the Wieliczka salt mine in Poland, but mines stretched across Europe from the Alps to Transylvania. Mining salt was brutal and dangerous. Unlike the surface evaporation pits, miners worked underground, in dark, damp shafts, illuminated only by oil lamps. The air was thick, cool, and heavy, echoing with the sound of picks striking stone. The men who descended into the mines often came from families tied to the profession for generations. Their lungs carried the dust of salt. Their skin bore the scars of pickaxes slipping in confined spaces. They lifted massive blocks of rock salt, hoisting them through wooden pulley systems or strapping them to mules that trudged along narrow tunnels. In these mines, the salt was not mere grains but slabs, great crystalline structures that, once hewn, had to be hacked apart and ground down. The taste of salt never left a miner's mouth. His lips were dry, his hands raw, and his body sore from laboring in the half-light. Despite the hardships, mining towns prospered. They built chapels underground, carved directly into salt walls, where miners prayed before each shift. These chapels, lit with flickering lamps, were as much a part of survival as the food salt helped preserve. The evaporation pits of inland Europe. In regions without coasts or mines, salt came from brine springs, water naturally infused with salt from underground deposits. Communities developed evaporation pits, boiling the brine in large iron pans suspended over fires. Here, the sound was not of the sea or the pickaxe, but of bubbling water, the crackle of wood burning, and the hiss of steam rising into rafters. These brine works consumed immense amounts of firewood, leading to deforestation in some areas. Families spent entire days feeding fires, skimming the surface of pans, and scraping the crystallized salt from their edges. Life around brine springs was often controlled by local lords or bishops who claimed rights over the salt works. The peasants provided the labor, while the authorities collected the profits. The smell of boiling brine hung thick over these villages, a constant reminder of work and obligation. The roads of salt. From these pans, mines, and pits stretched roads of salt, or salt routes. Picture caravans of ox carts creaking along rutted dirt tracks, wheels sinking into mud, drivers walking beside them with staffs in hand. These were not glorious highways, but practical lifelines, built not for speed but endurance. Each cart carried sacks of salt tied in leather or hemp. Guards sometimes accompanied the caravans, for salt was valuable enough to tempt bandits. At toll stations, travelers paid duties, adding to the wealth of lords, bishops, and kings. Bridges rose not because of armies, but because salt wagons needed to cross rivers. Inns and taverns sprouted along these routes, their benches worn smooth by the constant flow of traders. Over centuries, some of these salt roads became the skeletons of Europe's modern highways, their lines surviving beneath centuries of paving stones. Daily life along the salt trade. For the common worker, life was not shaped by the glamour of distant markets, but by the routine of labor. A salt pan worker rose before dawn, tended the pools, collected the brine crusts, ate bread hardened with yesterday's grains, and collapsed into sleep as the sky darkened. A miner spent his life underground, hearing the creak of timbers, fearing collapses. His body stooped with the weight of hauling blocks. His children often followed him, not by choice but by lack of alternative. A brine boiler's family lived with soot and steam, their houses reeking of brine, their clothes stiff with salt residue. What bound them together was monotony and necessity. Salt work did not make most rich. It bound them in obligation to rulers, merchants, or guilds. And yet, their labor allowed villages and kingdoms to endure winters, to supply armies, to stock monasteries, to feed distant cities. A substance that bound Europe. By the end of the medieval era, salt had shaped entire networks of roads, towns, and relationships. From Venice to Lubeck, from the French Atlantic coast to the Carpathians, salt moved in a ceaseless flow. It taxed bodies, it taxed communities, and it taxed economies. You might be tempted to see salt as a background detail, but to those who lived in its shadow, it was life itself. It flavored not just meals but existence. And yet, even as salt built these vast routes, it carried with it tensions. Who controlled salt? Who profited and who labored? Who set the tolls on the roads? Who guarded the wagons and who tried to steal them? So, in this first section, you have walked along the salt roads, peered into the salt pans, descended into the mines, and felt the sting of brine on cracked hands. Salt, so mundane today, was once a mineral that demanded constant labor, travel, and negotiation. But as salt flowed across Europe, it did more than preserve food. It preserved wealth and power for some, while draining the labor of many. And as tolls and taxes multiplied, rulers learned that salt could be not just sustenance, but revenue. The question, then, lingers. What happened when salt itself became a tool of politics, taxation, and revolt? Salt, power, and the politics of taxation. Salt, so simple to hold in your hand, had the power to change the lives of entire kingdoms. In medieval and early modern Europe, rulers discovered that the mineral was not just useful for food, but also for filling their treasuries. Salt became entangled with politics. Kings and bishops realized that if salt was essential to life, then taxing it guaranteed revenue. No matter how burdensome, people could not stop buying salt. This section will follow the story of how salt moved from a necessity of daily life into the machinery of governance. We will examine tolls, monopolies, guilds, and the dreaded salt taxes that stirred discontent across regions. The birth of salt taxes. The earliest salt taxes were little more than tolls along the salt roads. A cart traveling from the French coast inland might pay 3 or 4 times before it reached its destination. Each barony or bishopric along the way saw in salt an opportunity. If salt wagons rolled past, why not levy a fee? The toll houses were modest, wooden booths, often perched beside bridges or river crossings, where guards stopped merchants and weighed the cargo. A clerk would dip a quill into ink, note the amount, and collect a coin or two. But small tolls multiplied. By the 13th century, some regions could barely transport salt without paying duties at every stage. What began as a trickle of income for rulers soon became an essential part of their budgets. Salt revenues built walls, paved streets, and supplied armies. The French gabelle, perhaps the most infamous salt tax in history, was the French gabelle. Introduced in the 14th century, it became a cornerstone of the monarchy's finances. The gabelle was not a simple toll, but a state-controlled monopoly. Under the gabelle, salt could only be purchased from royal warehouses at prices set by the crown. Each household was required by law to buy a minimum quantity of salt every year, regardless of whether they wanted it or not. This mandatory purchase ensured steady revenue. Imagine it, a peasant family scraping together coins to buy their allotted salt, even if they had no need for more. Fines and penalties awaited those who refused. The resentment was immense. People smuggled salt across borders, hid their purchases, and engaged in elaborate schemes to avoid the tax. Smugglers known as faux sonneurs became both reviled and romanticized figures, slipping through forests and marshes with sacks of contraband salt. For centuries, the gabelle endured, fueling discontent that eventually contributed to the anger behind the French Revolution. The guilds and monopolies. Salt was also controlled by guilds and merchant leagues, especially in regions like the Holy Roman Empire. The Hanseatic League, that network of northern European trading cities, dealt extensively in salted fish, particularly herring. Control over salt sources was vital. Guilds organized everything from the measurement of salt to the terms of its sale. They standardized barrels, set prices, and punished those who tried to undercut the trade. For fishermen along the Baltic and North Seas, salt was inseparable from their livelihoods. Without it, their catch spoiled before reaching markets inland. And so salt merchants gained prestige. Some built houses of stone in Lübeck or Hamburg, their fortunes resting not on jewels or spices, but on this dull mineral. Yet behind their wealth lay the toil of miners, pan workers, and peasants, those whose labor created the salt but rarely saw the profit. Salt and the church. The church, too, played its part. Monasteries often controlled salt springs, particularly in Germany and Austria. Monks, while devoted to prayer, also became administrators of salt production. They managed workers, collected rents, and sold the mineral at a profit. In places like Salzburg, literally the Salt City, the archbishops drew vast revenues from the trade. Cathedrals rose, financed in part by salt wealth. Pilgrims might marvel at the splendor of the churches without realizing that the gleaming stone had been paid for by countless hours of boiling brine and hauling blocks. In this way, salt connected the spiritual with the material. Even prayers, sung beneath vaulted ceilings, resonated with the echoes of salt wealth. Salt and the state. By the 15th and 16th centuries, rulers recognized salt as a dependable source of income. Unlike land taxes, which fluctuated with harvests, or customs duties, which varied with trade, salt guaranteed stability. People could not stop needing it. Some states established full monopolies. Venice, with its maritime power, controlled vast salt works and distributed the mineral across the Mediterranean. The Republic's merchants carried salt alongside spices, wine, and textiles. For Venice, salt was less glamorous than silk, but far more secure as revenue. In England, duties on salt funded not just trade but war. Salted fish sustained sailors. Salted meat provisioned armies. The state's reach extended from the shore to the battlefield, and salt flowed through every channel. Smuggling and resistance. Wherever salt was taxed, smuggling followed. In France, salt smugglers carried contraband in hollowed-out walking sticks, barrels with false bottoms, or sacks disguised as grain. In Italy, smugglers used mountain passes, leading donkeys loaded with hidden bags. Authorities responded harshly. Punishments ranged from fines to imprisonment, even execution in extreme cases. But the smuggling continued. People resented not the necessity of salt, but the intrusion of rulers into its distribution. For many, smuggling became not only a necessity, but a form of quiet rebellion. To sneak a handful of untaxed salt into one's kitchen was to resist the weight of authority. The weight of salt on ordinary people. What did all this mean for the common family? It meant that salt, though essential, was never neutral. A peasant might rise at dawn to tend fields, knowing that the salt he sprinkled on his meager meal carried the mark of taxation. A fisherman might mend his nets, cursing the price of the salt he needed to preserve his catch. For the wealthy, the tax was an irritation. For the poor, it was a burden. And so, salt became a measure not just of preservation, but of inequality. The resentment simmered quietly, like brine in an iron pan. Families endured, but they remembered. And over time, resentment of salt taxes contributed to broader discontent with ruling powers. Salt, once a mineral harvested by peasants and miners, had become an instrument of governance. Kings, bishops, and guilds turned necessity into monopoly, extracting revenue from the very grain that flavored bread and preserved meat. And yet, with every toll and every tax, resentment grew. Smugglers thrived, discontent spread, and salt ceased to be merely a seasoning. It became a symbol of inequality, of authority, of resistance. But what happened when discontent reached its peak? What role did salt play when revolts erupted, when wars demanded supplies, when empires tried to hold themselves together?